Year after year, on this day, the 4th of November, I remember you. In my thoughts and in my feelings, I walk past your graves, one by one. The one with the makeshift post on Liberation Square, aged 15. The two by the children's playground. No names. The graves of those whom I saw going, singing, to demonstrate by the parliament, and never returned. A girl who was hit by a bullet right by my side, not further away than you are from her now, watching her picture. The All Saints' Day candles burning everywhere we traveled across the country, in memory of the dead. On the 4th of November 1956, in the morning, there was deep, ominous silence. And by this time of the night, 20 years ago today, we knew we had lost. That the miracle, our victory, was condemned to be a 9 days wonder.
This brief, haunting sequence is the opening of a film about the Hungarian uprising in 1956. It's called My Homeland and was directed by Robert Vas, a Hungarian who came to England as a refugee and who spent the last 10 years of his life producing a body of distinguished and impassioned documentaries for the BBC. He died a month ago, aged 47. To understand the range and nature of his work, it's necessary to know something about the man. History hadn't been very kind to him. He spent much of his childhood in a Nazi-controlled ghetto from which he witnessed the massacre by shooting and dumping into the Danube of a majority of the inmates. But it was the failure of the Hungarian uprising which was the central event of his life and the spiritual source of most of his work. Lyndon Brook, a friend of Robert's for many years, is reading from Robert's own account of the time.
And there was, of course, the system. The youthful, joyous, communist system to which all my young friends had subscribed. I found myself marching, believing, and holding the flag. Soon after, my father escaped from the country and went to Australia. I was left on my own and had to hold on to something. That something was the communist youth movement. However, the fact that my father was in the West automatically made me an enemy of the people. I had to do laboring work by day, and I worked as a projectionist at night. When I married and we had a child, my wife had to live in one place, I in another. And so, gradually, with one bitter experience after another, it dawned on many of us that there was a devastating abyss between the things we were being told by the regime and the things that happened to us. Not only me, but my whole generation became opposed to the regime. Then Stalin died, and the thaw came. The Hungarian writers started to publish their protests, and from then on, no one could stop the tide of revolt. We found ourselves in the streets, in the middle of a revolution. On the 23rd of October, 1956, I left my projector at 2 o'clock and never went back. I went to search for my wife, a fourth-year student at the time, because the news had come through, the students are demonstrating. We worked together for the next few days, printing, delivering leaflets. We had the incredible experience of a few days of freedom. And then the Russians came, and the tanks. We had nothing to stay for. We left illegally about 2 weeks later. We came to England. Everything seemed to be alive and sparkling. Great things were happening in drama, literature, and the cinema. I felt like a bird of paradise.
Robert spoke very little English at this time, but managed to get himself a job at the British Film Institute, cataloguing the film magazines. He steeped himself in the film classics at the National Film Theatre. And soon he was in the streets of London with Walter Lassley as cameraman, making his first tentative film, a fiction about an exile's first day in the big city.
When will I become a simple, average pedestrian like they are? How long time must pass till I will greet with a bye-bye cheerio? How could I address these people with different thoughts and different feelings, feel the same as they do? And if in some days, maybe I will work with you, or with you, what will you say? If I could speak English and ask you now, please help me to find a home, what would you say? One day, I will ask you for a job. Or you. Or maybe you. What will you say?
How to address these people with different thoughts and feelings? The question began to obsess him.
I had been scarred by two shattering events, the Nazis and 1956. And this baggage I brought with me, this message, was absolutely central to me. I couldn't exist without it. I had to talk about it. And I had to learn to talk about it to an English audience.
In his search for new routes, Robert turned to English books, theatre, films. He made friends with the free cinema filmmakers and, more important, fell in love with the films of the documentarist Humphrey Jennings. Jennings provided an initiation for him not only into England, but also into a particular kind of subjective, poetic filmmaking. Many years later, he made a film about Jennings for the BBC, in which this debt was clearly acknowledged. Here's the opening passage, beginning with a long quotation from Jennings' own film, Listen to Britain.
The images, the sounds, the moods, the feelings, the people of Britain at war. Listen to Britain.
This is the BBC Home and Forces programs. Here is the news, and this is Joseph McLeod reading.
On Sunday, 24 September 1950 in the morning, on board a small steamer from Athens to the island of Poros, was an English documentary filmmaker and artist, Humphrey Jennings. He was 43. It was to be his last journey. 20 years later, I too arrived at Poros to search for the story of his sudden, tragic death. He fell off a cliff 30 feet. As I retraced his route, I was overcome by the feeling of such appalling, idiotic waste. That he should die like this on a quiet Sunday under the sky of sunny Greece, he who was so much a poet of war and a poet of England. To me, a filmmaker coming from another country, he was able to put into pictures and sounds the spirit of an era and of a nation. He invented a particular kind of poetic film language, a visual thought process, complex and essentially humane, that is unique in the history of the cinema. It seems to me that his life, whether fulfilled or unfulfilled, allows us a glimpse into something one could call the essential quality of being English, of being an English artist.
A visual thought process, complex and essentially humane. By the time Robert came some years later to make his own major film about English life, he'd learnt the lessons of his master. The subject of 9 Days in 26 was the general strike. Coming from outside, he tackled it without preconceptions. His view of the events slowly developed during the process of research.
I soon came to realize that this particular crisis of British history was constantly and repeatedly seen from one viewpoint, that of the middle class. A cozy consensus existed which ignored the real price in human suffering and the complexity of the conflict behind the strike. The middle class view dwells on certain myths, how the nation was strong enough not to be broken, how marvelous we were to survive such an ordeal. I felt there was a need for another, perhaps a different interpretation of the same truth, using the same material. I set out to find it.
For us, who didn't really realize perhaps all the implications, it was a grand time. And the one we look back to with nostalgia almost. We were dancing in the street until some hours of the night. The weather was glorious, what we call in South Wales strike weather. Bright by day and by night. And we danced to the moon, of course, and in those days to a piano or a gramophone.
If they'd have stuck out another couple of days, I think that history of this country would have got its sense of values right. I do believe that. We was left out. We was left out, and we'd lost. We were starved back. We had to submit. And it didn't make things better. As a matter of fact, there was 1 million out of work. In another 2 years, there was nearly 1.5 million. You see what I mean?
Oh, he was a very big man, very well built. He had a back like a wall. And he was very good, you know. Strong. When the strike was over and other trades started to pull up, you know, they went to work. Well, there was nothing at all done for the miners. and they became depressed and bitter. And the effect it had on them when they knew it had collapsed was absolutely devastating. Nobody would believe, you know, that everyone out, that it would last any length of time, which it did. And he was a different person. After he'd gone through it, he was a different person altogether. Much more serious, quiet.
They were martyrs, marching and protesting. Against what? Against conditions. All they were wanting, they were just wanting a job. They weren't wanting the moon, they weren't wanting less rent, or like we've got today and things like that. They were wanting a job, to become a man again, to become somebody. Because when you're unemployed, it's an awful thing. You feel as if you're not wanted.
May 1926, the general strike. Newspapers cease printing on the stroke of midnight. At labor headquarters, the TUC orders nationwide down tools. Everybody has to foot it to work. Millions volunteer against this menace to liberty. Armored cars escort food convoys. The gigantic milk pool functions from Hyde Park. Babies at least will have their milk. British people have shown once again they will not stand tyranny. Strikers' attempted dictation is a damp squib.
9 Days in 26 is an extraordinary film, original in dramatic conception, intelligent and compassionate in tone. Robert had this gift for making his films speak through the experiences of honourable, decent people. He'd find them, interview them, and then, so to speak, use them as his voice. He'd set them against newsreel and library shots, pictures from history, and then fuse them with the feelings of people who'd been part of that history. And he wasn't content to work at the level of reportage. In his hands, pictures of actuality, coal pickers scratching for remnants on windy slag heaps, pit ponies frisking above ground during the strike, but shackled below ground after the miners' defeat. In Robert's hands, these stock shots came to speak as metaphors. But the picture ran into difficulties. Its projected showing coincided with the miners' strike of 1974, and the BBC decided to shelve it for 3 months.
I felt that, unknown to myself, and together with my colleague, Tom Scott Robson, we had achieved something that was immediately relevant and responsible. We felt that the film should be shown at that moment, that it could be a starting point for a sane, constructive discussion about the state of the nation. I felt that if you have freedom, you must have the courage to look into the face of history. But having said that, I must reiterate that the film was made, and I had complete freedom in doing it, and that ultimately it was shown. But if they allowed it to be made, why weren't they proud of it?
The courage to look into the face of history. During the 70s, Robert Vas made 4 more major films for the BBC. Orders from Above, about the forced repatriation of Cossacks at the end of the war, a film about the Katyn massacre, a film about Hiroshima, and a film about Stalin. All these films dealt with subjects which Robert felt were somehow being swept under the carpet. Someone should speak about them, and he did. My aim, he said, is to inspire thought, to remind, and to warn. Here's an excerpt from his monumental film about Stalin, in which he tries to convey the essentially religious nature of the Stalin cult.
At the age of 15, he was awarded a scholarship to the Orthodox Theological Seminary in Tiflis. The budding poet, former choir boy, and ardent patriot set out to become a priest.
Bow down thine ear, O Lord, and hear me, for I am poor and in misery. Be merciful unto me, O Lord. Be merciful unto me, O Lord. Comfort the soul of thy servant, for unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul. For thou, Lord, art good and gracious. Among the gods there is none like unto thee, O Lord, for thou art great and doest wondrous things.
O great Stalin, O leader of the peoples, thou who broughtest men to birth, thou who fructifiest the earth, thou who restorest the centuries.
Thou who makest bloom the spring, thou who makest vibrate the musical chords, thou splendor of my spring. O thou sun reflected by millions of hearts.
In the opening of the film on Hiroshima, To Die, to Live, Robert speculated about the impossibility of confronting so fearsome a subject. But confront it he did, and through a characteristic switch of viewpoint, he searched for witnesses, and then asked us, the viewers, to try to attune our senses to the words and feelings of the survivors.
Standing in the ruins. Going along the dirt road, I see the winter sun shine brightly. The young shoots can be seen already, steadily pushing through the ashes. And yet I look in vain for my young one, hearing only the far sound of a cold wind. I stand on the Ioi bridge, sick at heart. In the deep waters, something flashes. Ah, it is but an image of his childhood. Why do I write about Hiroshima? Well, my child was killed, and so were many others in the war. I survived. And because I survived, as a witness, I started to write.
This is a sort of sacred place of this orphanage. Every morning I make an offering to the memory of the dead. On this plaque it says, "How sad the wounded people are. They are dying. Why didn't we give them water? How terrible those fires. We must give the dying people water."
When I wrote about Hiroshima, about trees and grass growing, I always saw in front of me the eyes of my child and the eyes of other people I knew who died in the bomb. I felt the soil of Hiroshima was mixed with the bones of the dead. And the young trees and grass growing out of the ground were, if I can speak metaphorically, the eyes of the dead, looking at the people who had survived.
Robert Vas believed absolutely in the importance of the testimony of artists. It's no accident that it's the voice of a Hiroshima poet which he wants us to hear, that his films about Hungary abound with quotations of verse, and that it was Jennings who led him to listen to Britain.
Solzhenitsyn has put the idea into words in his Nobel Prize speech, the idea that it is the writer, the artist, who records and formulates history. Once an artistic truth, a poem, is actually put down on paper, it cannot be undone, and it can work miracles. That is why in my Hungarian film I have the close-ups of all those hands reaching for the falling leaflets, scraps of paper. They are reaching for the word, for the writing on the wall. Remember, it was Nikita Khrushchev who said, if 10 or so Hungarian writers had been shot at the right moment, the revolution would never have occurred.
For all his love and commitment to England, Robert's thoughts kept returning to his beloved Hungary. So it's proper to end this brief celebration of his work with a film in which he asks us to join him in listening to her poets.
Is it the landscape that means so much, even after so many years? The openness, the defenselessness of the great plain. Does it explain something of the national character, of history? I remember well the frequent excursions to the Buddha Mountains. In the darkest years of oppression, this seemed to be the only thing one was free to do. The forests and the meadows, they couldn't take away. And poetry.
Nem tudhatom. Radnóti Miklós verse. Nem tudhatom, hogy másnak-e tájék mit jelent. Nekem szülőhazám.
I do not know, by Miklós Radnóti. A poem he wrote only a few months before he was shot in November 1944.
Belőle nőttem én, mint fatörzsből gyönge ágon.
And far away from his homeland.
Testem is majd e földbe süpped el. Itthon vagyok. S ha néha lábamhoz térdepel egy-egy bokor, nevét is, virágát is tudom. Tudom, hogy merre menni.
I don't know what this region means to others. It is my birthplace, though now ringed with flames. A little land, my long-lost childhood's world. I grew up from this tree trunk, a frail twig. My corpse, I hope, will rest beneath this soil. Here I'm at home. The bowed shrub at my feet, I recognize the flower and know its name. I know the road and those who come and go. I know, too, what the summer sunset means, with reddening pain poured out from sweating walls. This region for the airman's just a map. He does not know here Vereshmate lived. For him, it's factories, barracks. But for me, it's crickets, oxen, church towers, gentle farmsteads. He, through his sights, sees chimneys, ploughed up fields, I see the workmen trembling for their toil. Woods, birds in orchards, vineyards and graves, by one of which a grandam noiseless weeps. From what up there's a target, rail or works, down here's the dwelling of the signalman. We see him standing here in front of it, the red flag in his hand, around him children, a sheepdog in the work yards frolicking. Nearby is a park with footprints of past loves and kisses honey sweet or bilberry sour. The years I went to school, I often stepped, for luck, on one stone in the sidewalk's edge, when fearing classroom tests. Here is the stone. From far above, it cannot well be seen. No instrument is able to detect it. Like other nations, we have greatly sinned. We know our sins, know when and how we sinned. But innocent are poets, laborers and babies, whose intelligence must shine, hidden away, protected in dark cellars, till peace once more its sign writes on our land. Then they, with fresh and open speech, will answer our stifled words. But shield us until then with your huge wings, O watching clouds of night.